Uh, Good evening. We're going to do, it's Rosh Chodesh, a good Chodesh to everybody. It's Rosh Chodesh Adar. What a beautiful religion to be a part of. That when we have to add to the calendar, we choose the 1 month that we're supposed to be happy. I mentioned, I think I mentioned this in Shul. I think I mentioned it by Shalosh Shudas, possibly. I don't know. But I had spoke in this past Sunday in Young Israel of Woodmere, and it was for the women's Rosh Chodesh year, and it was about happiness. And I pointed out a thought that I had, which I'll open with tonight because it is Rosh Chodesh Adar, that happiness, having to speak about happiness, my mind went to the gematria of the word simcha, right? Mishenichnas Adar Mabrim b'simcha. So the root of happiness, simcha, is sameach. What's the gematria of sameach? Tonight I'll make sure that we're not muted like last week. So someone quickly tell me, what's the gematria of sameach?
348.
348 is correct. And I thought to myself, that doesn't mean anything. What's 348? But then I realized, that's mightily close to the days of the Jewish year. The lunar year famously is 354 days, the Gemara tells us. You can make that calculation yourself. Of course, that's still true today. But it's off. It's off by 6 days. No. And then I'm driving and I think to myself, whoa, 1 second. The Torah says, V'samachta, the same root, b'chagecha. We should be joyous on those days that we don't do labor due to it being Yom Tov. How many days of the year is that? You have, let's go through it. 1 day Rosh Hashanah, 1 day Sukkot, 1 day Shmini Atzeres, 1 day Pesach, then the last day Pesach, and 1 day Shavuos. Boom. Yom Kippur's Shabbat Shabbos. It's very different. Those days require Simcha Yisera. Now you may think, Hashem, the Torah commands only on those days to be happy. Says God, no. The other 348 days you have to be happy. And to remind you of that, the gematria of the word of Simcha is 348. I was so excited when I thought of that. And I shared that with the women there. And I said, if anybody could find this in a sefer, because I don't want to quote myself saying this. I want someone else has to say this. It seems so obvious once you hear it. Okay. So this is not a typical shir for this week and next. We'll discuss Purim and Megillas Esther. I could speak about Purim. Really, I don't think this is an exaggeration. I could start talking now and spend 8 hours every day of the work week till Purim and not run out of things to say, because Purim and Megillas Esther in particular is chock full of secrets. It's funny. I sent Barbara the poster for tonight, and she goes, "Rabbi, you can't send out this poster." I said, "Why not?" She said, "The women's Rosh Chodesh share already covered this. It was also about secrets of Megillas Esther." I said, "I promise you, there's enough secrets to go around." I mean, I can't say for sure I'm not going to cover anything that they said. I doubt it. Because to even begin to discuss secrets of Purim and Megillas Esther, we have to start at the very beginning. And when I say the very beginning, I mean literally the beginning. We may have time to discuss who wrote Megillas Esther, because we all know when you read Megillas Esther, there were these 2 letters that went out. And in one of them, it seems Mordechai and Esther wrote them. And another one, it seems that Esther wrote it. Who wrote the Megillah that we have today? But even before we get to that, we have to ask some very basic questions. I'm going to ask questions that I've never asked before. And please unmute yourself and see if you could answer this question. Now, we all know, and I have spoken before, and you don't need me to tell you, that Tanakh is broken up into 3 parts: Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. And there's actually halachos that go with this. The Chazal tell us that Torah, of course, is holier than Nevi'im, Ksuvim. Nevi'im is holier than Ksuvim. And Ksuvim is holier than any books after it, but not holier than any books before it. And we talked about that we all know the difference between Torah and Nevi'im. Torah was given ba'aspakliria de me'ira. It wasn't given through prophecy, but through direct communication, whereas Nevi'im was given through prophecy. Now, what's then the difference between Nevi'im and Ksuvim? We're not going to discuss that tonight. We've discussed that in prior shiurim at other times. If anybody wants, I can send you writings that I wrote on it. You could take a look yourself. But I want to ask another question, because we tend to divide it into 4 parts. Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim. Can anybody guess what the 4th category is?
Megillos.
Megillos. What in the world are Megillos? Now, how many Megillos are there?
5.
Now, everybody knows there are 5, because you could go to a bookstore and buy the 5 Megillos. The 5 Megillos are, let's see if we can do this: Esther, Shir Hashirim, Rus,
Kohelet,
Kohelet,
and Tisha
right? Those are the 5. And Eicha.
B'Av.
Eicha, excuse me. And Eicha. Now, I should point out that nowhere, this is pretty amazing. And so the first question we have to ask is, why is it called the Megillah? The literal word, by the way, this is why I say there's so much to talk about Purim, because even just opening with the title, we have an hour of talking to do. What is a Megillah? So the word Megillah literally means scroll. In fact, the Gemara discusses, and we have mentioned in other venues, that the Torah was not given on Shavuos. If the Torah was given at Har Sinai on Shavuos, if that's what we celebrate on Shavuos, that can't be true, because that was given right when we left Mitzrayim, 50 days later. So didn't the Meraglim see Parsha Shlach? Didn't Korach see what he was going to do? Oh, look, there's a Parsha named after me. Let's see what I'm going to do. Oh, no, I better not do it. So the Gemara asks, when was the Torah Shebichsav given? Torah Shebal Peh was given over for 40 years. Everybody has it backwards. They think Torah Shebichsav came first, and then we interpret it with rabbinic Judaism with Torah Shebal Peh. Au contraire, we received the Torah Shebal Peh. There were only 10 things written. Those were the Aseres Adibros. They were written bichsav, in writing. For 40 years, Moshe told us the Torah Shebal Peh. And the Gemara asks, then when was the Torah given? So the Gemara gives 2 views. One of them is Megillos, and one of them is the Torah was given all on Moshe's last day. But the first opinion is every time Moshe went into the Ohel Moed, he came out with a new parsha. But Megillah means scroll after scroll. Throughout the Talmud Bavli, now I didn't do a search, but I'm pretty confident in myself, there is not one book in Tanakh called Megillah except for Megillas Esther. In fact, Megillas Esther, when the Gemara dedicates a Masechta to the laws and the story of Purim and Esther and Mordechai, what is that Masechta called? Megillah.
Megillah.
And there's no confusion. Which Megillah? Megillas Eicha? Because in the Talmud Bavli, there's only one Megillah. So now this is getting really bizarre, because where do these 5 Megillas come from? Nowhere in Shas is Eicha or Shir Hashirim or Kohelet called a Megillah. But then I was thinking, and this is all thinking today, I never really thought about this question before. Then I'm thinking even more about this, and I say, one second. There's a Yerushalmi in Shabbos that calls Eicha Megillas Kinos, the Megillah of Lamentations. But that's not really a question, because who wrote Eicha? Someone unmute yourself. Who wrote Eicha?
Yirmiyahu.
Yirmiyahu. And it's actually referenced in Sefer Yirmiyahu. And in Perek Lamed Vav, if you could look it up while I speak, and I think it's Pasuk Yudalid, somewhere around there in the middle of the Perek, he calls his book that he was writing, what does he call it? Megillah. It's a scroll. And he gives the scroll to a shomer, so the king doesn't burn it again, but he calls it a Megillah. So the fact that the Gemara calls it a Megillah is not strange. It would seem to me, I mean, there are early sources, Masechta Sofrim may allude to the concept of Megillah, but there's really no such category. In fact, so really the only Megillah is Megillas Esther. There is a colloquialism that we use that we call the Megillos. But the true Megillah is Megillas Esther. And I'll prove it to you. If you were naming the story of Purim, the book that we read Purim night and Purim day, what would you call it? Now, it's weird enough that we call the holiday Purim. We'll get to that later. That's one of the weirdest names of a holiday in the history of naming of a story. Like if you would read Megillas Esther, and now you said, it says at the end that from now on, for generations, Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim, that we're going to accept this as a holiday. What's the holiday called? I could think of 100 names before I would get to Purim, but leave that aside. If you're naming the book, what would you name the book? I mean, first of all, if you want to name after somebody, Megillas Mordechai, Megillas Esther, Megillas Hadassah, by the way, would make even more sense. Just as an aside, that was her Hebrew name. No one's going to call, my Nasano, his legal documents call him Nathan. I wouldn't call it Megillas Nathan. At least use it her Megillas Haman would be a good one. So the Sfarim tell us, and this is just an appetizer. We didn't even get to the main body of tonight's discussion. Rabbi Yonasan Eibishit says, the reason why it's named after Esther and why we choose her Persian name, which means moon. In fact, it could be that the etymology of the word star comes from Esther. But the reason why we use that name is because the Gemara asks, Esther min ha-Torah minayin. Where do we see an allusion to Esther in the Torah? Does anybody recall what the Gemara says is the answer?
Esther Panecha.
Esther Panai, that Hashem hid his face. So this is the Megillas Esther. This is the story or a story of Hashem hiding his face. That's the real translation of this Megillah, the one and only Megillah. That's Rabbi Yonasan Eibishit's interpretation. However, other Sfarim point out that's just the beginning. Because just call it Esther. Does anybody ever say, what time is Esther today? Now, you would say, what time is Rus? What time is Eicha? When are they reading Koheles? What time are they learning Shir Hashirim? These are all statements that we've made in our Jewish careers. Nobody has ever said, what time is Esther? They say, what time is the Megillah or Megillas Esther. So the Sfarim say something fascinating because we start off with a question. Why are there 5 Megillas? And I told you it's a colloquialism. There's only one book truly called the Megillah, and that's Megillas Esther. Eicha is sometimes referenced that because Yirmiyahu used that nickname. So we explained that, and then we asked, why is it called Esther? Because Hashem hid his face. But now we're going to learn something else. The name isn't Esther, but it's a Megillah, so it's Megillah of Esther. If that was the case, we would call it Megillas Koheles. What time are we learning Megillas Rus? The name of the book, listen closely, the name of the book is not Esther. The name of the book is Megillas Esther. Because Hashem was hidden, but then he revealed himself. V'nahapachu, he turned it around. What does the word migaleh mean?
Reveal.
Recover. Megillas Esther, the revelation of the hidden. Wow, isn't that amazing? So that's just, so we're already 15 minutes in, and we just got to the name of the Megillah. And I'm telling you right now, we're not going to get to the story tonight, so don't get excited, because this Yom Tov is so teeming in this month, is so teeming with meaning. I don't even know where to begin. So I decided tonight, let's begin with the Megillah, but what precedes the Megillah, okay? Next question. So now we have this Megillas Esther, the revelation of the hidden. And there's probably the most famous question, maybe the first question every child is asked on the Megillah. And I mentioned this to my wife the other day that I wanted to research this, and I'm going to get to what her response was in a few moments, but I first have to ask the question. So what's the first question every child, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, comes home from yeshiva, day school, wherever they Jewish Talmud Torah, and they come home and they read a sheet on the Purim. The most common question that they ask and answer is, why isn't God's name in the Megillah? It is such a common and elementary question that it loses its dynamism. Because if you think about it, this question, it's such an oddity. It's a prodigious peculiarity. It doesn't make any sense. Here you have, think about this, a sefer written by prophets. Esther was a prophet, Mordechai was a prophet, to be read every year for the past over 2,000 years, 2,250 years. It's the only book in the Nevi'im Ksuvim to be read even when Mashiach comes. It's included in our holy canon, in Tanakh. And it omits the one true author of the events. So this is a very serious question. Now, the most popular answer that a child comes home with is the answer that you're all thinking in your head. And it actually comes from the Maharal. You should be aware where this famous answer comes from, because I should point out, as far as I know, the Gemara doesn't discuss this oddity. Now, everybody says, every time it says Melech, it's really referring to Hashem. Maybe, I don't know. Is that a medrash? I, as people who know me, anything after the Gemara, I want to learn from, but it's not Torah Messina. At that point, it's not Torah Messina. If it's a Rishon and he says it as if it's a tradition, then I'll accept it. But if he's just saying a hashara, a thought, as I always say, the Torah was only given once at Har Sinai. That's it. It was never going to be given again. And everything we have that we know for certain has to come from that moment. So the Gemara never mentions this. It's the Rishonim who point this out, and it's a serious problem. So the famous answer comes from the Maharal. So I'm going to repeat it because we all know it, and I have to say it because otherwise people are going to say that's the answer. But at least now you know this answer was first given in the 16th century. So until the 16th century, nobody heard of this answer. The answer the Maharal gives actually relates to the idea we gave from Yonis and Eibeshitz of Megillas Esther, the Megala, the Haster, the revelation of the hidden. Since Hashem was hidden, says the Maharal, since this is a story of Hashem hiding his face, so he's hidden in the Megillah itself. I'm sure everybody heard the story, this answer. And this is why Hashem's name is not mentioned. So tonight, at least to start with, I'm going to give you 7 other answers to this question. And I hope that you recognize the seriousness of this question. Imagine, and the best place to imagine is that you're a Baal Tshuva, or you're a new ger to Judaism, a convert, and you see all this pomp and circumstance, the celebration, the preparation. I was in coming from yeshiva now, and I was working in the Rebbeim's office. It's really my office, but the second Seder Rebbeim use it when I'm supposed to leave, but I stayed late tonight. And the Rebbe plugged in his phone. Of course, it's a flip phone without texting or anything, certainly without internet. And he plugs it in, it's charging, and the phone is buzzing away while he's giving shir. So afterwards, when he finishes shir, I said, your phone was going crazy. He goes, oh, it's my kids. They're driving me crazy with Purim shtick. I said, your kids do Purim shtick on you? I said, if my kids did Purim shtick on me, it would be Yom Kippurim shtick. Are you crazy? He goes, no, they're not doing Purim shtick on me. I live in Muncie. The store next to my house sells Purim shtick, meaning it's Erev Rosh Chodesh Adar, and his kids are calling their father, who's a Rebbe in Telz, giving shir about buying Purim shtick. So there's 2 weeks of preparation, and then costumes, and then shalach manos, and they come to shul, and the kids are dressed up, and they going to hear the Megillah for the first time, and it is a document devoid of religiosity. Devoid of religiosity. And even if you say you see how Hashem was behind the scenes saving the day, so say it. You bury the lead. It never says, and Hashem was doing X. And it doesn't even say at the end, and Hashem saved the day. Nothing. It says Mordechai was loved by most people. Anyway, So this is a very, I hope I highlighted that this question that we all knew since our youth, we need to revisit it in our adulthood. So we heard Megillas Esther, the Maharal's answer. Let me share with you 7 other interpretations. We're going to go through them quickly because we have other questions to get to if we can. So the Ibn Ezra, the Ibn Ezra, you think of Chumash. There's an Ibn Ezra on Megillas Esther, just like there's a Rashi. In fact, I would advise everybody, instead of reading the next great book in English about Megillas Esther with these great interpretations, or even instead of listening to my shir, if you want to learn Megillas Esther, sit down with a Chumash, with a translation if you want, with Rashi. Just start with Rashi. Anyway, so the Ibn Ezra and the Rokeach, by the way, the Ibn Ezra, it's on the first pasuk. The Rokeach, you want to look it up, it's in Perek Yud pasuk Beis. They say something very interesting. They say historically, whenever non-Jews will get a hold of a Chumash, they would take out Hashem's name and put in their own gods. The Ibn Ezra, in fact, gives an example. He says, Bereshis bar Elokim, in his day, the leaders wiped out Elokim and wrote Bara Ashima. Shima was some type of belief they had at the time. So he says that because, listen closely, because Mordechai and Esther were writing down one political moment in history of a king and a queen and an advisor, if they would they would assume that most governments would want to get a hold of this document. And if they got a hold of the document, they would erase God's name and put in their own name. So Mordechai and Esther said, look, we're saying this story, this one political moment in history. We don't want kings and queens to erase God's name. Let's just not put God's name in it. That's what the Ibn Ezra says. It's not my interpretation. Interesting interpretation, maybe. Then comes along the Shevet HaMusar. Shevet HaMusar says something unbelievable. Shevet HaMusar died in 1729. He wrote many Sfarim. The sefer that I'm quoting from is called Einei Ha'eda, the eyes of the nation, or the eyes of the community. It's a commentary to Tanakh. And in his section on Megillah, he asks this question. He says, what is this? That Hashem's not mentioned in a sefer in Tanakh? This is so bizarre. So he says something so amazing. We can't forget, before Purim, we read Parsha Zachar because Megillas Esther is, after all, a story about Amalek. He quotes a Medrash Tanchuma. You probably haven't seen this Medrash Tanchuma. I haven't seen it until I saw it brought in the Sefer. In Parshas Kiseitze, the Medrash Tanchuma says, Amar Rabbi Levi v'shem Rabbi Chama bar Chanina. Rabbi Levi says the name of Rabbi Chama bar Chanina. Kol zman sha'amalek ba'olam. So long as Amalek is still existing in this world, Shem shall Hashem eino sholem. The name of Hashem is not at peace or is not whole. The kisei hakavod and the throne of Hashem lo b'shalom is not whole or not at peace. Only, says the Medrash, when Amalek is completely eradicated, will Hashem's name be whole. So says the Shevet HaMusar, because at the end of the story, we beat Haman, but Amalek was not eradicated. Amalek still had remnants, so Hashem's name wasn't whole, and we demonstrate that by omitting Hashem's name. Now, I promise you, the answers are going to get more fascinating as we go, although I find all of these answers fascinating. Then there's a sefer, a really fascinating approach. There's a sefer called Yosef Lekach. Now, Yosef Lekach was written in about 1550. Okay, so we're going back to the end of the Rishonim, the beginning of the Achronim. It was written by someone by the name of Rabbi Eliezer Ashkenazi. Rabbi Eliezer Ashkenazi, ironically, was a Rav in many Sephardi countries, but eventually wound up in Venice and then in Krakow, so certainly an Ashkenazi community. He was a very controversial figure. He argued with Maharal, like he's going to do right now, giving a different answer. But he argued with Gedolim on major issues. That being said, he was known as a brilliant Talmudic scholar, a brilliant Torah scholar, even though he was controversial. So he wrote a sefer, Yosef Lekach. Now, if his background is not interesting enough, he dedicates his book on Esther, Yosef Lekach, to Joseph Nasi. Now, I don't know if people are history buffs, but Joseph Nasi was the Duke of Naxos. He was really a Turkish dignitary, and he traveled around the world as a Jewish in those days, they would choose people from different religions to represent different governments. And he was like the Jewish representative of many Muslim and Christian nations. And he dedicates his book in this dignitary, his honor. And Yosef Nasi. Yosef Nasi, by the way, is a story for a different time. How he died is fascinating. But while he was a dignitary, he did raise a lot of funds from governments to support Rabbanim and Svarim and Tmidei Chachamim. He also would debate Christians as to the veracity of Judaism, a very noble, unknown person in history. So he dedicates, Rabbi Ashkenazi dedicates his book on Megillas Esther to Joseph Nasi, the Duke of Naxos. So why am I telling you this whole background of the Sefer? Because perhaps he was thinking about his dedicatee, the person who he dedicated the Sefer to, when he asks this question and he supplies the following answer. He says, maybe Hashem's name is not mentioned because when does the Megillah reach its crescendo? It reaches its crescendo when the Jewish hunted become the Jewish hunters, the Vinahapachu, when we're able to kill our enemy. And we joyously remember this moment of killing our enemy each and every year. So politically, writes the Yosef Lekach, how dangerous it would be to give the appearance that this is a religious document. Because if we gave the appearance that this, even though it is a religious document, we don't want to give it the appearance. Because if it would be perceived as a religious document, people would think that Jews relish and revel in the death of their Gentile enemies. So what did Mordechai and Esther do, says the Yosef Lekach? He removes all religious elements from the text. So no Gentile should get the wrong opinion. Okay, let's go a little bit deeper. Another interpretation. The Shevet Musar, we're going to quote him again. He says, you want to know why God's name is not mentioned? And this answer is my third favorite. The next three, the last three, are my three favorites. Say the best for last. So out of my three favorites, this is number 3. I don't know if you're familiar. The Gemara tells us that until Purim, if a Jew sinned, he can't be blamed because he could tell God, it's not my fault. You put a mountain over my head. I had no choice but to say Nasa v'nishma. We all know Hashem turned Har Sinai, placed it over the Jews, Kahar Kagigos, and said, accept the Torah or not, I'll kill you. So it's not my fault. But once the story of Purim happened, we said, Kimu v'kiblu ha-Yehudim. We accepted the Torah for ourselves on our own volition. Not only that, when we were suffering and Haman was going to kill us, we took personal responsibility. We did tshuva. We fasted. We didn't complain to the leader like we did in the desert to Moshe. We fasted. We did tshuva. We davened. So we did it on our own, says the Shevet HaMosar. And Hashem wanted the Nevi'im to celebrate that we did it on our own. So Hashem isn't mentioned. Now, that's a wild interpretation. Because even if we did it on our own, you can still mention Hashem. Reb Tzadok, the great Rebbe of Lublin, used to say that even when it comes to tshuva, we can't do it on our own. Even when it comes to tshuva, we don't say Kaichi va'otzam yadi. So how could it be that God isn't mentioned because we did it on our own? Is there anything we do on our own? But then I remembered a beautiful idea in the Nefesh HaChaim, of Chaim Volozhin, the founder of the modern yeshiva movement. The Soloveitchiks, the Cutlers, the Feinsteins, everything came from Chaim Volozhin. Chaim Volozhin says, there's a very famous Mishnah, the last Mishnah in Sota, that says, if you want to know Mashiach is going to come, it's a very famous Mishnah, there's going to be inflation, oil rates are going to rise, and chutzpah yaski. And there's going to be a lot of chutzpah in the world, and on and on and on it goes. And then the Mishnah ends, and we have no salvation other than God himself. So Chaim Volozhin says, everybody reads this Mishnah wrong. They think the Mishnah is saying it's going to be chutzpah, there's going to be inflation, there's going to be war, all these bad things, and we're going to finally realize we have to rely on God. One silver lining. No, says Reb Chaim, that's part of the negative prediction. There's going to be all these things bad happening in the world. And how are we going to respond? God will fix it. We won't take personal responsibility. That's the sign. That's the sign that it's Mashiach. Because there's always been generations where bad things are happening. But the time before Mashiach, we're going to say, leave it. Hashem will take care of it. I always say the story of my Rosh Hashiva who asked me to do something for him. And I said, Amir Tzah Hashem. And he said, Moshe, leave Hashem out of it. I'm asking you, are you going to do it or not? So that's the Shevet HaMusar's second interpretation. The Jews took personal responsibility. They listened to their leaders. They didn't complain to Hashem. Hashem says, you know what? Don't mention my name. You did this on your own. Beautiful, beautiful. And you could take that with you into Purim, why it's such a physical Yom Tif. You drink and you get dressed up and you eat because it's about you. It's about your body. It's about Klal Yisrael as a nation. Without turning to Hashem, did it on our own. We saved ourselves. Beautiful interpretation. Now, my second favorite interpretation. This morning, somebody whispered in my ear in shul the following words. Putin is Hitler. I bristled when he said that. Not because I think Putin is a good guy. Putin's obviously a Russia Marusha. Is he Hitler? Time will tell. I hope not. But I bristled for a different reason. And it has to do with this next interpretation. The Shevet Musar gives a third interpretation. Before I tell you this interpretation, to connect it to Putin, let me tell you something that some of you may know pieces of, but I spent a lot of time doing research on this several years ago. Adolf Hitler, I want to read from the Jewish Telegraph Agency. This is the JTA, April 8th, 1935. Quote, Adolf Hitler was compared today with Haman, or Haman, the Persian minister of ancient times who plotted to massacre the Jews. Now, who compared him to Hitler? He did. To Haman, excuse me, he did. In an article appearing in the Nazi paper Judenkenner. Quote, the Nazis wrote, both Hitler and Haman are leaders with a profound knowledge of the Jews. And it wasn't just Hitler. You know who the first people who ever compared Hitler to Haman? 2 months after Hitler was elected. And never forget, like Putin, that Hitler was democratically elected. There was a Purim Suda in, ready for it? In the city of Harlan, Kentucky. Now, I stumbled across this. It's a long story how I found this. I called the ISJL, which is the Institute of Southern Jewish Learning, to get a hold of this document, which I did. If anybody wants to see it, I could send it to you. So in Harlan, Kentucky, which I looked it up on Wikipedia, as of the year 2000, their Jewish population was 0.00%. But that wasn't the case in 33. So they have this big Purim Suda, and they're all drinking. And it's unclear exactly how what next came to be. But at some point that evening, they drafted a press release, which they sent to President Roosevelt and to the American ambassador of Germany. I'm going to read it to you. So we're going back almost 100 years ago to a Purim Suda in Harlan, Kentucky. Quote, Monday, March 12th, 1933. Over 100 men, women, and children gathered under the auspices of the B'nai Shalom congregation of southwestern Kentucky to celebrate the feast of Purim, founded on the dramatic story of the biblical book of Esther, dating back to 4 BCE. In the course of the meeting, a motion was adopted to draft resolutions protecting against Haman-like designs of the German Hitler against German Jews. So we called him Haman, but Hitler himself called him Haman. In fact, one Purim, the SS guards, Yimach Shemam v'Zichram, took 10 Jews to be hanged in Zunkavala for payment, the kama for the hanging of Haman's 10 sons. That Shavuos, by the way, they hanged another 10 Jews for the 10 Dibros, but to focus on Purim. Of course, and everybody knows the story of the Nuremberg trials, where 12 men were sentenced to be hanged, but Göring committed suicide and Martin Bormann was absent, so 10 men were hanged. And if that doesn't sound familiar, like the 10 sons of Haman, Julius Streicher, who ran the propaganda arm for the Nazis, when he was taken to be hanged, can anybody unmute themselves? What did he say? Anybody know?
Purim.
Purim Fest.
Purim Fest.
Purim Fest 1946, he said. And in fact, Time Magazine, if they reported March 7, 2012, not too long ago, so 10 years ago, I could send you the article if anybody wants it, that Hitler himself, in a speech that he gave in 1944, he wrote, quote, "If the Jews defeat me, they should make a second Purim." Now, this might make for interesting history, but what does that have to do with our question? And the Shevet Musar explains, Amalek thrives. Oh, I'm God's foe. I fight with the Jewish God. They love it. They love the attention. They'll take pride in the fact that Hashem had to wage war with them. They're the foe of the Borei Olam. So therefore, Mordechai and Esther said, I'm not even going to mention Hashem's name in this. I don't want to give the remnants of Amalek any pride that they're so chashuv that Hashem has to contend with them. And that's why Hashem's name is mentioned. So don't mention great historical leaders with the same sentence as Putin. Don't give him that attention. He wants that attention. Maybe not to be compared to Hitler, who was, of course, a Russian foe, but certainly with other great men of history, he would love it. I can't believe how late it is. I had 5 other topics to get to, so we'll continue this next week. But now let me end with my favorite explanation. I've shared this explanation I've shared before. I used it in a drasha 2 years ago, I think. I love this idea. It used to be the only answer I knew till today to this question. The pasuk tells us that when God wanted to kill the Jews after the sin of the golden calf, Moshe said, forgive them. Hashem said, no. Moshe said, Mecheni na mesifrecha, erase me from your book. I don't want to see bad things happen. The Shevet Musar, and therefore Moshe's name was absent from the tzava. And this is when I told my wife what I want to write about, she said, didn't you just speak about it? She said, oh, no, that's right. You spoke about Moshe not being mentioned. And she makes a good point. There are 2 times that someone's not mentioned, oddly. One is Moshe and Tetzaveh, and the other one is Hashem and Megillas Esther. And the Shevet Musar makes that connection. And he says, HaKadosh, listen to this. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God was so inspired by Moshe's dedication to the Jews that he promised himself that if he ever decides to kill the Jews, like the Medrash says and Eicha Rabbah and the Gemara Megillah, that he really did, then I disappointed them. And I don't want my name mentioned. Isn't that unbelievable? Hashem, we deserve to be killed, but Hashem felt so bad that he had to do that like Moshe, he said, Mecheni na mesifrecha, erase me from your book. So now, what did we accomplish in the 40 minutes tonight? We discussed that the name Megillah doesn't really exist. It's only by Esther. We also pointed out that perhaps that is the full name of the book, Megillas Esther, the revelation of the hidden. We then asked a simple question, why God's name isn't mentioned? And we gave 8 answers in order of my favorite, my least favorite, although that's also great, to my most favorite. And now we're at the story. And next week, we'll discuss the story. I'll tell you my favorite ideas on the story of Megillas Esther and the holiday of Purim itself. I think you're really going to enjoy it. If you want, we could stay on for another hour. I could do it now. I'm itching to do it, but I'm going to stop now. Everybody have a good night. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.